They say silence is louder when it holds back truth. And mine had been roaring for years. I stood still at the back of the Navy SEAL graduation, just another man in a blazer tucked into the shadows, arms folded, sunglasses disguising eyes that had seen too much. The sun beat down on the open-air ceremony, casting a sharp glare off the brass buttons and polished boots. Rows of crisp uniforms gleamed, families beaming in their best dresses and suits. And at the center of it all, standing tall and soaking in the thunder of applause, was Trevor Kincaid, my wife's golden boy brother. Chest puffed out like he'd built the ship himself, Trevor stood in the spotlight, basking in the adoration that came so easily to him. A new SEAL, a fresh badge of honor. My in-laws sat front and center, of course, Martin and Eleanor Kincaid, Navy pedigree incarnate. Martin was the sort of man who wore his own medals to someone else's ceremony, just to remind the room who had come before. I'd seen him do it at dinner once, clinking his glass with a ringed hand and a ribboned chest, the legacy of saltwater and commands rolling off him like perfume. They never liked me. That was fine. I wasn't here to be liked. They thought I was a failure, a dropout, a man who couldn't hack it, the son-in-law who flunked out of the Naval Academy and never made anything of himself. They never asked. They just assumed. I let them. For national security, I had to. My silence was armor. But standing there, behind the last row of chairs, my back to the concrete wall, I felt something shift. A crack in the illusion. The crowd leaned forward as Rear Admiral Carrington took the stage. Silver hair, hard jaw, voice that didn't need a mic even though he wore one. I hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. The last time, we were shoulder-deep in a classified joint operation that didn't officially exist. But here, under blue skies and blaring brass bands, he was all protocol and pomp. He started with the usual words, honor, duty, sacrifice. But then his eyes swept the crowd. He paused, froze, and then he saw me. It wasn't a passing glance. It was a full stop. His mouth parted, barely enough for a syllable. He blinked like he was recalibrating. Then, without even glancing at his notes, he spoke. Colonel Ellison, you're here? My name cracked through the crowd like a rifle shot. Heads turned. Dozens of them. Cameras lowered. The music faded into stunned silence. Martin Kincaid went pale, ghost white, like the blood had dropped from his face all at once. Eleanor's manicured fingers curled tighter around her purse. Trevor stiffened, confused, still locked in parade rest, but now no longer the focal point. And Sienna, my wife, her mouth opened slightly, her lipstick barely smudged by the gasp she hadn't meant to make. Her eyes locked on me, wide and searching. I didn't move, just gave a slow, professional nod. The kind of nod that doesn't give anything away but tells the right people everything they need to know. Carrington smiled faintly. It's good to see you again, sir. Sir. I could practically feel the tremor ripple through the seating rows. I hadn't worn a uniform to this thing. I hadn't announced I was coming. Hell, I hadn't even RSVP'd. I'd slipped in with the general crowd, uninvited, unacknowledged. But my mere presence had detonated years of assumptions in a single breath. Martin looked like he was trying to make sense of a language he didn't know. His mouth opened, then shut again. He leaned toward Eleanor, whispering furiously, but she had nothing to offer. Sienna looked like someone had lifted a curtain in her mind she didn't even know was there. I had never intended for it to come out like this. Not here. Not now. But Carrington had recognized me, and in his world, respect was never hidden. It was declared. And now, my secret was airborne. I watched Trevor squint at me, confusion turning to suspicion. He didn't know me. Not really. To him, I was just his boring brother-in-law, some paper-pushing ex-Navy grunt who couldn't stick to the program. I used to take his jabs with a smile, drink his beer at cookouts, nod along when he bragged about finally doing what Marcus couldn't. And now he was staring at me like I was a stranger. Because I was. And maybe I'd always been. The Admiral cleared his throat, continuing the speech like nothing had happened. But the moment lingered, sticky and sharp, suspended in the air between them all. I stayed put, arms crossed, watching their carefully constructed reality unravel. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A secure message. I ignored it. I was on personal time for once. Sienna turned halfway in her seat, hesitant, as if trying to read me from a distance. I could see the questions in her face, the slow recollection of moments she hadn't understood it. My sudden disappearances, the vague job title, the scars I never explained. All of it was rewriting itself behind her eyes. She'd always accepted my excuses because she loved me. Or maybe because she didn't want to look too closely. Now she didn't have a choice. When the ceremony ended, people clapped with less energy than they started. Some eyes still flicked toward me, whispers curling between chairs. Trevor stood proudly when his name was called, saluted, marched forward to receive his trident. But he kept glancing toward the back, toward me. And for the first time, I think he wondered whether he had truly earned the spotlight or just inherited it by default. I didn't stay long after, just long enough to see the last salute, long enough to feel the burn of being seen for the first time in a place that spent years pretending I didn't exist. As I turned to go, I caught Carrington nodding in my direction again. Hell of a day for a ghost to show up, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I smiled. Maybe it was. When I married Sienna, I knew exactly what I was stepping into. The Kincaids were a Navy family through and through, generations of sailors, officers, commanders. They wore their legacy like armor, and they measured worth in deployments and medals. And me? I was the outlier from day one. The man without a public rank. The one they whispered about at Christmas dinners and shook their heads at when they thought I wasn't listening. Martin Kincaid, my father-in-law, never pretended to accept me. The man made it his mission to remind me, subtly or directly, that I didn't belong in their world. Retired Navy commander. Distinguished. Decorated. And disappointed from the moment he shook my hand. I remember the first dinner I had with Sienna's family after we got engaged. Martin asked me, with that smug undertone of his, if I still had my rejection letter from the Naval Academy framed somewhere. I just smiled. Didn't need it framed, I said. I never got one. That shut him up for a second, but only a second. Because in their version of the story, I'd failed. Washed out. Disappeared from the program sometime during my third year, and didn't look back. They filled in the blanks with failure because that was easier than the truth. Easier than imagining I was plucked from the academy midstream. Handpicked for a black-budget Air Force division whose name still doesn't officially exist. Even Sienna didn't know. She married a man who told her he worked in classified systems support for defense contracts. It wasn't entirely a lie, just the surface of it. I kept her life clean. I shielded her from the dirt and danger of what I did. I left the house in button-ups and slacks, came home smelling like paper and ink, not desert wind or gun oil. The blood on my boots never touched our carpet. But her family never stopped digging or mocking. Every Kincaid holiday had the same pattern. Eleanor, her mother, would sip her wine and toss compliments like knives. Some people serve with distinction, she said once, right in front of me, and some just get by. That was code for me. Always was. Trevor, Sienna's younger brother, was their golden seal pup. Fast-tracked, praised, and practically canonized. His acceptance letter into BUD/S training was framed before he even finished the paperwork. Martin bragged about it at the country club. Eleanor had it in her email signature. Me? I was the guy who couldn't cut it. I let them think that. I let them laugh. Because the truth would have cost lives. Because operational security is more than silence. It's becoming the lie so well. Even you forget the edges of who you really are. They had no idea the kind of weight I carried. The things I'd seen. The missions I'd led. When I missed Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, they thought I was just avoiding the family. In reality, I was buried in the Afghan highlands, pulling intel from a collapsed safe house. When I returned a week later, Sienna's only question was if I'd finally gotten around to replacing the brakes on her car. I smiled, nodded, kissed her forehead, and went to sleep with dirt under my nails and shrapnel in my side. Sometimes I'd watch Martin talk to Trevor like they were in some sacred league of warriors. Son, he'd say, the Navy doesn't just teach you discipline, it teaches you identity. You'll know who you are out there. And Trevor would beam like he'd unlocked something ancient. Meanwhile, I was the embarrassment. The footnote. There were times I wanted to scream. To slam down a file on the dinner table marked top secret and point to the redacted lines. This is what I did while you laughed. But that's not how this life works. My victories couldn't be paraded. My scars had to remain covered. Even my name, in some reports, was replaced with aliases that I don't even remember anymore. The hardest part wasn't the ridicule, it was Sienna's silence. She never defended me. Not really. She didn't join in, but she didn't stop it either. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe she didn't want to believe her husband was anything other than what her family said. Over time, I stopped expecting it. I stopped hoping she'd say, "That's enough," or "You don't know the whole story." Because she didn't, and I wasn't allowed to give it to her. But that didn't make it easier to swallow. I became the ghost in their lineage. The one who didn't belong in the family photo. The one who held the camera while everyone else posed in uniform. At Trevor's graduation from officer candidate school, they invited Sienna's cousin Logan as her +1 because they assumed I wouldn't be interested in that kind of thing. I was in Yemen that week, coordinating a sting on a rogue nuclear scientist. But when I got the wedding-style photo album in the mail from Eleanor, there wasn't a single mention of me. Just a card that read, "Hope you're doing well in your field." My field? You mean the field where I parachuted into enemy territory under moonlight to retrieve compromised allies? The one where I bled in sandstorms and memorized coordinates I wasn't allowed to write down? That field? But I swallowed it. Again and again. Because protecting the mission meant protecting the myth. I wore their condescension like a second skin. I smiled, nodded, played the fool. Until now. Rear Admiral Carrington's words back at the graduation had begun a ripple, but that ripple was coming for everything. For all the jokes, the dismissals, the underhanded comments. I wasn't just a man they didn't understand. I was the man they refused to see. And that refusal had built a wall between us for years. Sometimes, I'd lie awake at night beside Sienna and wonder what it would be like to live without secrets. To wake up and say, I saved 30 men from a hostage situation yesterday. To look her in the eye and explain the tremble in my hands wasn't from caffeine, it was from holding a trigger too long. But instead, I said I had meetings, that the reports were endless, that I was tired from sitting too long. I wonder now if she ever believed me. But it didn't matter then. I had a duty, not to Martin, not to Trevor, not even to myself, to the mission, to the men I'd buried, to the silence I'd chosen, to the people who owed their lives to a man Sienna's family mocked over wine and steak. I let them laugh, because I knew the truth. And sometimes, truth is a burden only the invisible can carry. Every time Sienna's family gathered, I knew my role before I even took off my coat. I was the man behind the camera, the one holding jackets, the one fetching extra chairs when her cousin's boyfriend showed up unannounced. The Kincaids didn't say it outright, but their actions carved it into every moment. I was not one of them. I wasn't part of the picture. Literally. At Christmas, they hung a massive family portrait over the fireplace, taken the previous year at the lake house. Sienna was there, of course, standing beside Trevor in his academy whites, Martin and Eleanor flanking them like royalty. Everyone smiling, stiff with pride. The lighting was perfect. The backdrop? That dramatic oak tree Eleanor insisted looked so Americana. The only problem? I'd taken the picture. I wasn't in it. I stood there for a long time that Christmas Eve, sipping bourbon and staring at that frame like it owed me something. Sienna came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist. You were behind the camera, babe, she whispered like that explained everything. Like that made it okay. I didn't say a word. Just nodded and took another slow sip. It wasn't just that one time. At every family event, I became a ghost. A helpful one, sure. Quiet. Predictable. The man who knows how to stay out of the way. Eleanor once said that to her bridge partner, right in front of me. Marcus doesn't take up too much space, she chuckled, clinking ice in her glass. Some men need attention. Marcus prefers the edges. What she meant was, Marcus knows his place. Trevor was always the sun in their solar system. From his first ROTC badge to the time he gave a 3-minute speech at some regional leadership summit, they treated every achievement like it was history in the making. Martin recorded the whole thing, then made DVDs and passed them out at Thanksgiving. Actual DVDs. In sleeves with custom labels. Me? I'd been in Bahrain the same week, coordinating a joint strike to dismantle a covert arms deal between two rogue states. But no one knew. No one asked. Trevor's the real deal, Eleanor liked to say, especially when she was 2 glasses in. Marcus just has other strengths. She said it the same way someone might talk about a child who's good with puzzles but bad at life. A backhanded compliment dressed in pearls and pity. They never invited me to military ceremonies, not even when they were local. Promotions, award nights, reunions, I'd see the pictures on Facebook after the fact. When I asked Sienna once, she sighed and said, they just assume you wouldn't be comfortable at those kinds of things. Because in their minds, I had failed the only test that mattered. They believed I'd washed out, that I hadn't been able to keep up. The Kincaid family story had already written me in as the flunked-out cadet who couldn't handle the pressure. And I never corrected them. Not because I was weak, but because truth, in my world, had a price. By the time I was recruited into the Black Budget program, my name had already been erased from the academy roster. Deliberately. I disappeared on paper for the same reason I stopped receiving public correspondence. I became operational ghost protocol. I was reassigned under classified designation, my clearance levels redacted, and my very existence, professionally, vanished. What they saw as failure was, in truth, the highest form of trust my country could offer. But you can't hang that on a wall. You can't wear it to a family reunion. Instead, I sat in their living rooms and let Trevor tell exaggerated stories about a training exercise that left him with a bruised rib and a funny story about some idiot trying to wrap hell upside down. They laughed like it was war. They cheered him like he'd taken a hill under enemy fire. Meanwhile, I'd spent that same month recovering from an op in northern Syria where we lost 3 men under my command and neutralized a compound with 6 hostages and 0 visibility. I still had the burns on my side. I'd stitched my own shoulder in a truck bed, but they didn't ask. They didn't want to know. There's a weight in silence, one I wore like a rucksack across years of dinners, birthdays, and barbecues. The worst part? I didn't hate them. I didn't even really blame them. It's human nature to simplify what we don't understand, to paint people with one brush. I gave them a version of myself, and they accepted it because it made sense, because it fit the story they wanted to tell. But the truth kept me awake some nights. Not because I regretted the choice, but because pretending to be small in a room full of people you love changes something in you. It shrinks you. And over time, even the strongest bones begin to ache under that kind of compression. One day, after a particularly grating comment from Martin about sticking to civilian life, I caught Trevor in the hallway alone. He was on his second beer, tie loose, still full of that buzzed self-importance he wore like aftershave. He leaned in and said, "You know, I used to think you were kind of pathetic. But now I think you're just harmless." I smiled. "Glad you're upgrading your opinion." He chuckled and slapped my shoulder like we were buddies. I held his gaze for an extra beat. "Be careful out there, Trevor. Sometimes the real enemies don't carry guns. They smile at you in broad daylight and shake your hand." He laughed it off, called me intense. But there was a flicker, just for a second, in his eyes. Something unsure. Good. Let that doubt sit. Let it grow. Because there's a kind of power in being underestimated, and letting people write you off while you move quietly in the margins. I had spent a career becoming invisible, because that's where real impact lies. Not in spotlights, but in shadows, in the things no one ever sees. That night, I went home and looked through some of the old photos on Sienna's phone. Her family had this habit of posting collages, moments stitched together in perfect lighting, all smiles and toasts. I wasn't in any of them. Not one. In the world they chose to see, I didn't exist. But I was there. I was always there. Saving lives. Holding secrets. Carrying weight none of them could lift. And one day, sooner than they thought, the ghost behind the camera would become the subject they could no longer ignore. When I proposed to Sienna, I was covered in someone else's blood. It had dried beneath my collar, invisible to the untrained eye. Not from a wound I'd taken, but from someone I'd had to carry to the evac chopper at the edge of a no-name ridge outside Mosul. I'd flown 12 hours in a bird so loud it rattled your teeth, been rerouted twice due to airspace risks, and landed with nothing but a sealed Pelican case and 48 hours of clearance. And in that case, a velvet box, nestled next to a flash drive with intel that would keep an embassy from burning to the ground. Sienna never knew. She thought I'd been consulting on infrastructure systems in Brussels. She picked me up at the airport with her usual warmth, curling into me like she had no idea my hands had been steady behind a scope 2 nights ago. I smiled, kissed her temple, and told her I missed her like hell. And I had. The proposal wasn't grand, just honest. I took her to the place we first kissed, an overlook above Silver Ridge, where the stars were thick and the wind carried no sound but her laughter. I dropped to one knee on uneven ground and opened the case, hoping the shaking in my hand didn't give anything away. She cried, said yes, wrapped herself around me like I was the only man in the world. I was exhausted, sore, half limping, and still tasted sand in my throat, but for that minute, I was only hers. No ranks, no protocols, no ghosts. I remember her calling her parents the next morning. She was giddy, glowing. Eleanor pretended to be thrilled. Martin barely grunted. And when he finally picked up the phone later to talk to me, the first thing he said was, "You got any plans to stick to something longer than a few months?" I let the jab land. I could have said so much. I could have told him that the reason I couldn't stay in one visible job for long was because I was never meant to. That every time I disappeared from one identity, I slid into another, A deep cover rotation built to mislead even those closest to me. That I didn't have a LinkedIn because my resume would detonate a dozen NDAs. But instead, I told him I worked in cyber infrastructure logistics. That's what we decided to call it. It sounded vague enough to be credible and boring enough to discourage follow-up questions. He scoffed, told me Sienna deserved stability. Told me he expected a man to build something that could be measured. I wanted to tell him I had built something missions no one would ever see. Maps that help strike teams come home. Cover identities that let me infiltrate networks designed to erase entire cities. But those weren't accomplishments you could hang on a wall next to a college diploma. So I said, "Yes, sir." Understood. Because that's what I always said. I didn't propose to Sienna to prove something to her family. I did it because, somehow, she made me feel human. When I was with her, the lies didn't burn as much. The duplicity didn't choke. She gave me room to breathe, even if she didn't know what she was breathing in. Our wedding was modest by Kincaid standards. A country club affair with polished silverware and silent judgments. Martin walked Sienna down the aisle with the pride of a man handing over something precious he wasn't sure I could protect. He gave a toast that felt more like a warning. "To a life of discipline," he said, lifting his glass, "because love without structure is just chaos with a pretty face." Everyone clapped. I nodded. He didn't see the irony. Structure? I lived inside the tightest confines imaginable. I'd eaten under blackout tents with men who hadn't bathed in weeks. I'd followed orders that shook my soul and still stood tall when the debrief came. I bled on timelines. Fought inside clockwork. I knew structure better than he ever would. But I didn't say that. I let the applause die. Let the clinking glasses wash over the edges of my quiet. Later that night, Sienna and I danced in that slow, awkward way that happens when the lights dim and the expectations fall away. She rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "He'll come around. He just doesn't know you." I kissed her forehead. That's kind of the point. I wanted to believe her. But I'd spent years learning to read people. Martin wasn't interested in knowing me. He'd already decided who I was. And that version didn't include valor or complexity. Just disappointment dressed up in formal wear. The first time I had to leave her on short notice was 6 weeks after the honeymoon. I told her I had to consult in Munich for a few days. She nodded, trusting. Packed my bag like it was any other trip. Kissed me goodbye with sleepy eyes and an open heart. I flew east instead. Into a city under lockdown, into a room with 4 men who didn't officially exist, where I'd spend the next 72 hours decoding an arms manifest that would later appear on a Senate floor with someone else's name on it. When I came back, Sienna had cooked dinner. She had wine open. Her hair still smelled like lavender from the shower. She told me about her week. I smiled, laughed, asked questions, played the role. Inside, I was exhausted. One wrong digit away from death the night before. But none of that came with me. None of it ever could. The mission behind our marriage was always the same: protect the perimeter. Keep her safe. Keep her happy. Lie if I had to. Smile when it burned. Say less, feel more. Because I believed that love, real love, was worth the cost of silence. But silence is a slow erosion. And with every gathering, every sideways glance from Eleanor, every dismissive comment from Martin about my ever-changing work, I felt pieces of myself start to fray. They didn't know that the ring I'd given Sienna had passed through 3 borders and a coded supply drop, that I'd hidden it beneath forged documents and thermal tape, praying it wouldn't be confiscated during a strip search in Amman, that I'd written my vows in a bunker lit by a single bulb swinging from a rusted chain. They didn't know. And back then, I didn't need them to. I thought loving her in silence was enough. But silence always has a breaking point, and I could feel mine coming. Thanksgiving always felt like a performance in the Kincaid household. A parade of expectations, polished silverware, and practiced smiles that stretched just tight enough to hide the judgment underneath. Eleanor Kincaid curated the day like an admiral preparing for inspection, every table setting calculated, every appetizer served like a tactical maneuver. And me? I was the wild card no one wanted to draw, but they played nice because Sienna loved me. We arrived 10 minutes early. Because lateness, in Martin Kincaid's mind, was a cardinal sin. I wore a plain navy button-down, slacks, and the softest smile I could manage. I'd just gotten back from an op in the Horn of Africa, a joint effort to shut down a black market supply chain funneling modified drones into civilian populations. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. My knees still ached from a scramble over razor wire fencing. The commendation letter was still in my duffel bag, signed and sealed, tucked beside a bloodied tactical glove I hadn't had time to wash. But none of that mattered. Because here, at this table, I was Marcus, the desk guy, the civilian, the disappointment. As we walked in, Eleanor greeted us with a double-cheek air kiss, her perfume strong and floral like something bottled in old money. "Sienna, you look radiant." "And Marcus," she said with a forced warmth that barely reached her eyes, still doing that thing with computers. I smiled. Yes. Still clicking away. Martin didn't even get up. He raised his glass from the recliner and gave me a look I'd come to recognize, disinterest dressed as tolerance. "You're lucky," he said. "Some of us had to serve the old-fashioned way to earn our turkey. Some of us still do," I murmured under my breath, but no one caught it. We moved into the dining room. Long table, perfectly ironed cloth, place cards scripted in delicate gold ink. I didn't have a place card. "Oh," Eleanor said, as if surprised. "We weren't sure if you'd make it. We put Logan there instead." She pointed to Sienna's cousin, a snide little investment banker with a laugh like a wheeze. I ended up wedged at the far end, between the drink station and a fake ficus. Sienna shot me an apologetic glance, but didn't say anything. She'd learned not to make waves. Not here. And then came the carving. Martin stood up, puffed with pride, eyes already gleaming at the moment he relished every year. "Trevor," he called, "why don't you do the honors this year? You've earned it." Trevor stood up, grinning wide, chest out, fresh out of his final SEAL prep round, still glowing from praise and sunburn. He pulled the carving knife like it was ceremonial. Eleanor clapped. Someone took out a phone to record it. I just watched. No one asked me. No one even glanced my way. That moment, small and stupid as it was, settled in my bones like ice. I'd spent years carving through silence, carving through enemy lines, carving names into the inside of my skull, so I'd never forget who didn't make it. But I wasn't allowed near the turkey. "You don't mind, right, Marcus?" Trevor asked with mock innocence, like it was charity. "Not at all," I said with a shrug. "You've trained for this moment your whole life." He laughed, not catching the edge in my tone. Or maybe he did and didn't care. Dinner went on like a well-rehearsed play. Eleanor complimented the gravy. Martin launched into one of his old sea stories about navigating a typhoon. Trevor chimed in with tales from BUD/S, embellished and dramatized, each word soaked in approval. I sat quietly, eating like a ghost. No one asked what I'd been up to. No one noticed the scar peeking beneath my sleeve or the way I shifted my weight to favor my right leg. "So Marcus," Logan asked suddenly, half drunk and smug, "still in that contractor job? Must be nice not having to deal with real pressure." I stared at him for a beat too long. In my head, I saw the pressure I'd just come from two operators pinned under debris in the desert, one of them screaming through broken teeth as we pulled him free. Pressure was deciding which building to breach when time was measured and lives lost. Pressure was holding a dying man's hand and telling him he'd make it when you both knew he wouldn't. "Yeah," I said finally, "the coffee's great." Everyone laughed. That was my job here, punchline without protest. After dinner, Martin pulled out a bottle of single malt scotch and poured for the men. Trevor, Logan, even his neighbor, whose only connection was helping install a fence once. I stood at the edge of the circle, unacknowledged, watching the amber liquid glisten. Sienna came over quietly and slid her hand into mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's okay," I said. But it wasn't, because for years, I'd let them build a version of me that was easier to mock. I wore the lie so well, even Sienna couldn't see past it anymore. I kept thinking that maybe if I loved her enough, if I kept my head down, if I waited, they'd come around. They'd realize I wasn't just a blank space in their family scrapbook. But they didn't want the truth. They wanted the fiction they'd always believed. And I was tired of playing along. I stepped outside onto the porch, the cold night air sharp against my skin. I pulled out my phone and opened the secure server app, flipping through a few archived photos from my last mission. Dusty terrain, encrypted maps, a folded flag passed to a widow. Proof. But no one here would want to see it. I stood out there alone for a long time, listening to the laughter spill through the windows like a party I was never really part of. Then, just before I turned to go back inside, my phone buzzed. A message. Short. Clean. "They're calling in favors. Carrington asked if you're ready." I stared at it, heart calm, like it always was before everything changed. Maybe I was. Maybe it was time the man they refused to see finally stepped into the light. I hadn't planned to go. I told myself it didn't matter. Trevor's Navy SEAL ceremony was just another performance in the long string of family events where I'd clap politely from the shadows, if I win at all. The truth was, I'd had enough of pretending. Enough of smiling while Martin threw jabs beneath his breath. Enough of nodding through Trevor's boastful stories and Eleanor's polished indifference. I wasn't obligated. No one expected me to show. And that was exactly why I did. I dressed simply charcoal slacks, a crisp black button-down, no tie, no medals, no insignia. I didn't need to wear my history. I lived it. There were no ribbons pinned to my chest that day. Just years of classified files, sealed commendations, and buried friends. The ceremony was held at the Coronado Amphitheater, blue Pacific sky above, a light breeze brushing against the rows of folding chairs. Families packed in tight, proud smiles and flag pins on their lapels. Children clutched miniature American flags, waving them without understanding what the uniforms really meant. I moved quietly toward the back row and stood instead of sitting, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding more than just the sun. It was a strange sensation. Being invisible in a crowd where, ironically, the highest-ranking man present would recognize me before my own family did. The brass band was already playing the opening notes of the anthem when the official party emerged, Rear Admiral Carrington among them. He hadn't changed much. Still walked like every step was measured. Still carried the authority of a man who'd stared into chaos and dared it to blink. He took his place at the podium, waiting until the band fell silent. I watched him scan the crowd with that slow, deliberate gaze. Not just looking searching. Then his eyes stopped. Right on me. I saw the hesitation flicker in his expression, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know him. But I did. I'd worked with him twice. Once in northern Syria during a hostage extraction that nearly collapsed midair, and once in Tunisia where we'd intercepted intel so sensitive, the files were physically incinerated the moment they were confirmed. He knew me. Not by rumor. Not by reputation. By action. By survival. His face broke into something between a smile and disbelief. And then he spoke. "Before we begin," he said, voice steady, echoing over the crowd, "I'd like to recognize someone who isn't here in uniform, but deserves more respect than most who are." Murmurs rippled through the seated families. Carrington looked directly at me, not blinking. "Colonel Ellison, you're here?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement shaped like surprise. It was acknowledgement. The sound around me faded. Just that one line, and the entire amphitheater froze. Every head turned. My name didn't belong to this crowd. Not to these people. It was like someone had played the wrong national anthem in the middle of a military ceremony. Martin twisted around in his seat, so fast it nearly knocked his program to the ground. His face paled, eyebrows furrowing into something like recognition and confusion battling for dominance. Eleanor turned next, lips slightly parted, her hand pressing against her chest like she'd been struck by a sudden chill. And Sienna, she stared, motionless, like her brain had stalled mid-thought. But Trevor just blinked, still standing up front in perfect posture, his training keeping him rooted while his mind clearly scrambled to catch up. Carrington went on like he hadn't just shattered the room. "This man ran point intel on more missions than I can legally disclose. He carried men out of places you'll never see on maps and put himself in front of fire more times than I can count. Some of us serve where we're seen. Some of us serve where no one can know. And some do both. Marcus Ellison is the latter." A pause. Then he added, quietly, "It's an honor." He turned back to the podium, adjusting his notes like he hadn't just turned my entire double life into exposed wire. I stood there, completely still, the weight of every hidden ear pressing against my ribs like armor plates I could finally breathe in. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't know how. I didn't expect them to. Sienna rose slowly, like her knees had to negotiate with her mind. Her eyes stayed locked on me, wide, what with something I couldn't name. Not yet. Not grief. Not pride. Something else. Recognition. Maybe. Shock. The understanding that everything she thought she knew about her husband had just cracked down the middle. Martin was still seated. Frozen. A man who had shaped his life around rank, order, and tradition, and who now realized he'd misjudged the man who sat at his table for 10 years. I could see the math happening behind his eyes. The timeline. The questions. The realization that all the jabs he'd thrown weren't just unfair, they were misguided. I nodded. Just once. A silent acknowledgement. I didn't want applause. I didn't want a speech. I just wanted the weight to shift. And it had. When the ceremony resumed, I stayed in the back, unmoving. The applause for the graduating SEALs returned, hesitant at first, then stronger. Trevor received his trident, and I watched as he accepted it with perfect form, but his expression had changed. A flicker of insecurity around the edges now, like he wasn't sure who the hero was anymore. After it ended, people began filing out. Some whispered, others stole glances at me. A few parents looked confused. A few officers looked wary. Carrington found me before I could disappear. He stepped into my space with a grin only someone like him could pull off. "Didn't think I'd see you here, Colonel. Didn't think I'd be seen," I said. His voice dropped. "About damn time you were." We didn't say goodbye. Just a mutual nod, the kind that carried 10 years of understanding. As I turned to leave, I saw Martin standing off to the side. No one else with him. Sienna was still sitting in the front row, unmoving. Trevor was being congratulated by a group of officers, but his eyes followed me, watching. I didn't stop to explain anything. There'd be time for that. Maybe. I left them with the truth sitting in their laps, still warm, still smoking from the moment Carrington had lit the match. And for the first time in years, I wasn't hiding behind a title. I wasn't behind the camera. I was no longer the ghost in the family photo. I was the man they never thought to look for. Until I stood where they could no longer ignore me. Carrington didn't stop to explain himself, and he didn't need to. When a man like that speaks, the room listens, whether it understands or not. But what he said next turned a silent recognition into a public reckoning. He stepped back to the microphone, scanning the crowd that still hadn't fully exhaled. The band had gone quiet again. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate. Trevor was still in position up front, his posture locked, but his face couldn't hide the swirl anymore. He was trying to stay composed, but it was clear, whatever confidence he carried into that ceremony had cracked. "This man," Carrington said, pointing in my direction with a firm open hand, "ran point intel on more missions than I can legally name. His tactics saved my men, saved me more than once. That's not gossip. That's not some patriotic story for your fridge. That's fact." A low hum rolled through the audience. Murmurs, confused glances, quiet gasps. Most of them didn't know who I was. And now, suddenly, I was standing in their narrative like a ghost stepping through a mirror. I felt a dozen eyes on me at once, some curious, some skeptical, some trying to recall whether they'd seen me on a wall, a screen, in a file. But no one said a word. Trevor turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me without breaking form. And I saw it. The first time in his life he'd ever looked at me not as a brother-in-law, not as a civilian, not as a disappointment, but as a man who might have done something bigger than he could imagine. The air around him changed. His jaw tightened, his shoulders twitched. And my father-in-law? Martin sat back slowly in his chair like someone had just cut the wires beneath him. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. Just stared. His hand loosened on the program he'd been clutching since the start. It dropped to his lap with a soft, final-sounding thud. Sienna had turned fully toward me by now. She wasn't crying, but she was visibly unraveling. Her eyes searched my face for answers, for context, for something that would make the years of quiet and dismissal make sense. But there was no easy way to explain what I had done and why I'd kept it from her. I gave her a nod, soft, apologetic. She nodded back, slow, like she wasn't sure whether she wanted to run toward me or away. Carrington closed his binder with the kind of finality that ended more than just a speech. "I won't pretend to know the stories this man can't tell you," he said, voice calm now. "But I'll say this. Some of us carry our service like a spotlight. Others carry it like a burden. He's done both. And you don't clap for that. You honor it." Then he stepped back. Just like that. Applause didn't come. Not immediately. It wasn't that kind of moment. What followed was heavier than applause. An entire ceremony shifted on its axis. The silence was reverent, uneasy. The audience had come expecting medals and pride and perfectly folded flags. But they'd been handed something else, truth wrapped in quiet power. When the proceedings continued, it felt like the script had been rewritten. Trevor's name was still called. He walked up to receive his trident with perfect form, and I clapped, genuinely, because I respected what he'd earned. But even from the back, I could see his eyes dart toward me twice before he saluted. He wasn't sure what kind of comparison had just been forced into the room, but he felt it. Everyone did. As the ceremony ended and the crowd rose, I stayed in place. I didn't want to be part of the post-ceremony smiles or backslaps. I wasn't there to make a point. I was just there. For the first time, not hidden. I caught glimpses of the family as they exited row by row. Eleanor looked like someone had served her unsalted soup. Her lips were pressed tight. She kept glancing toward Martin, waiting for a signal that never came. Martin walked with measured steps, not speaking, not acknowledging anyone. He didn't even glance back. But Sienna stopped. Right at the edge of the seating area, she turned around and walked slowly toward me, high heels clicking against the cement. "What did he mean?" she asked. "Colonel." I didn't speak for a moment. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't just confused. She was cracked open. Years of assumptions, family jokes, and quiet doubts unraveling all at once. And I had done that. "It's a long story," I said. She crossed her arms. "How long?" I almost laughed. "About 15 years. Maybe more." She blinked, then whispered, "So you weren't a failure?" That stung, even though she didn't mean it cruelly. It was just the truth, what they'd all believed. What I'd let them believe. "No," I said. "I wasn't." "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked past her, to the sea of uniforms now milling around the lawn. "Because I wasn't allowed to. For your safety. For mine. For everyone I ever worked with. The kind of work I did doesn't go in family albums." She exhaled sharply and stepped back like the space between us had changed dimensions. "You let them humiliate you." I nodded. "Yeah, because the alternative was worse. You don't get to live a normal life if you tell the truth about mine." She didn't speak. She just stood there for a long while, trying to reconcile the man she married with the one she just met. Behind her, Trevor approached cautiously, still in dress uniform. He looked taller now, somehow more rigid and more humble all at once. "Colonel," he said, nodding slightly. I nodded back. "Lieutenant." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't know." "I know. I said a lot of crap over the years." "You did." A pause. "I get it now," he said. "At least a little." "That's enough," I replied. He held out a hand. I took it. His grip was firm, respectful, for the first time. As he walked off, I turned back to Sienna, who was still looking at me like I was a puzzle that had rearranged its own edges. I didn't ask her to forgive me. Not yet. There were too many years between what she thought and what she now knew. But I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there in a long time, something beyond love. Recognition. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the silence had been broken. And once truth breathes, it doesn't go back into hiding. Dinner after the ceremony was never part of the plan. I had thought I would slip away, unnoticed, or at least unbothered. But plans mean very little when the truth breaks the surface and refuses to sink again. Sienna had texted me before I could disappear. "They want to talk. Come to the dinner. Please." Just those few words. Simple. But beneath them, I felt the tremor of something bigger. They didn't want to talk. They needed to. The restaurant was upscale, tucked into a quiet block downtown, dimly lit with flickering candles on each table, and soft jazz humming like it was scared to offend. We had a private room, a long table set for 7. Martin and Eleanor were already seated when I walked in. Trevor, too. Sienna was beside an empty chair she clearly meant for me. No one smiled. "Marcus," Eleanor said stiffly. Martin didn't speak. He didn't even nod. Just stared at the unrolled napkin in front of him like it held a code he hadn't cracked yet. Trevor sat upright, his uniform exchanged for a simple dress shirt, the kind of civilian outfit that made him look young again. Maybe he felt young now. Or maybe small. I took my seat in silence. The waiter came and went, water poured, menus distributed, orders taken with mumbled voices. It was all formality. None of us had the appetite to match the occasion. It was Eleanor who spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, and there was no fire behind it. Just confusion wrapped in pride that had been dealt a blow. All this time, we thought. I nodded. "I know what you thought." Martin's knuckles tightened around the edge of the table. "You let us believe you failed," Eleanor continued, voice tightening. "You let me believe my daughter married a man who couldn't finish what he started." "I did," I said, calmly. Sienna looked at me, eyes still full of questions. "But why?" I breathed in slowly. "Because I wasn't allowed to tell you otherwise. I was pulled from the Academy for Recruitment into a black-budget Air Force program that doesn't officially exist. I signed things that make me liable if I ever talk about the wrong detail to the wrong person. Everything you thought was me giving up, was me disappearing so others could survive." Martin finally looked up. "Why you?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard. Not mocking, not even doubtful, just bewildered. "Why would they pick you?" "Because I knew how to vanish," I said. "I knew how to move without making noise. I was good with systems, fluent in 3 dialects, and I didn't have anything tying me to an ego that needed medals. I passed a psych eval they don't even administer to most candidates. I was built for the shadows. Trevor looked like he'd been holding a breath for 10 years. All those years we thought you were just floating, he said softly, working odd jobs, disappearing at holidays. I was deployed, I replied. More times than I can count. He swallowed, hard. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, like the weight of it all had finally landed. So when we were sitting around the fire, joking about you being a dropout, she trailed off. I was carrying a fractured comms unit through a hillside in Kandahar, I finished for her. Or maybe I was sitting in a safe house waiting to be exfilled. It doesn't really matter. No, Martin said. It does. The table went quiet again. The waiter brought out appetizers no one touched. Sienna reached under the table and gently slid her fingers into mine. What can you tell us? She asked. Now. I exhaled. Very little. The specifics are still classified. But I can say this. I was responsible for real-time intelligence that shaped missions. I led a team of 6 through rotations that never made headlines. We operated where policy couldn't. We cleaned up the mess before politicians could make speeches. And we buried our own. Trevor stared into his glass. I looked up to you, he muttered. Before I decided not to. I smiled faintly. I always looked out for you. Whether you knew it or not. Martin's hands were folded on the table now. Neatly. Intentionally. I taught my kids that service was sacred, he said. That wearing the uniform was the highest act of duty. And I judged you for not wearing it. He paused, voice beginning to fray. Turns out, you wore it deeper than any of us. I didn't answer. Not immediately. There are moments where the words cheapen the weight of what's being said. I just nodded. It wasn't personal, I said finally. Not keeping it from you. It was protocol. I gave it everything I had, every part of me. The only thing I protected from that life was this family. You could have told us, Eleanor insisted, but her voice lacked the edge it usually carried. And then what? I asked. You wouldn't have believed me. You would have Googled it, tried to verify, and when nothing came up, you'd have thought I was fabricating some story to patch up your disappointment. The only way I could protect the mission and this marriage was to let you all believe I was less than I am. Trevor leaned forward. I believe you now. Good, I said, because I never stopped believing in all of you. That hit harder than I intended. Sienna was crying now, quietly, wiping at her cheek with a napkin she never unfolded. I turned my hand palm up, and she gripped it tighter. Martin pushed his chair back, slowly. I watched him stand, one careful motion at a time, like the room itself had shifted. He walked to my side of the table. And then stiffly, but without hesitation, he extended his hand. Colonel Ellison, he said, voice low, but clear. Thank you for your service. I stood, took his hand, felt the shake settle into something final. Something honest. You're welcome, I replied. He nodded once, and in that nod was something I had never received from him before, respect untainted by rank or bloodline. Not because of what I'd married into, but because of what I'd endured in silence. Dinner didn't last long after that. The food came and went untouched. The silence, however, stayed. Not the old silence. Not the cold dismissal I'd lived through for a decade. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after a storm, when the truth finally has room to breathe. The next family gathering came faster than I expected. Normally, these things were choreographed months in advance, holiday schedules compared, flights booked, dresses and suits steamed like they were prepping for a royal banquet instead of just another Kincaid dinner. But this time, no formal invitations. No smug group chat pings with passive-aggressive reminders about RSVPs. Just a quiet message from Sienna that said, come with me. It'll be different now. I didn't believe that. Not entirely. Old habits die hard, especially in families where pride runs deeper than blood. But I went. Because something had shifted in the wake of that ceremony, something I couldn't fully name. Truth has a strange way of infecting even the most stubborn narratives. The gathering was at Eleanor and Martin's home. Same polished wood floors, same portraits of Trevor in various stages of uniformed excellence lining the hallway. Nothing about the house had changed, but everything about the air inside it had. When we walked in, Martin met us at the door. Not Eleanor. Not Trevor. Martin. He shook my hand. That alone would have knocked me sideways a year ago. But then he took it a step further. This is my son-in-law, Colonel Marcus Ellison, he said, turning toward a man I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, mid-50s. Wearing a subtle navy pin on his lapel. Air Force Special Operations. I stared at Martin, blinking once. Twice. For a second, I thought maybe he was mocking me. But no, his tone was even. His jaw was set in something like reverence. I'd spent over a decade letting this man ignore me like I was a background prop in his family tableau. And now, here he was, laying my title down like a stone in the foundation of his legacy. The other man extended his hand. Doug Harlow. Served with your father-in-law back in '89. Heard about the seal ceremony. Good to meet you, sir, I said, shaking his hand. Hell of a thing, being seen after all this time, isn't it? He added with a knowing smirk. That was the understatement of the decade. We moved into the living room where Eleanor, who used to greet me with a tight smile and a glimmer of judgment, actually stood to hug me. Hug me. You look well, she said. So do you, I replied, because I didn't know what else to say. The others were already gathered. Trevor was near the fireplace, sipping a beer, chatting with Sienna's cousin Logan. But even he glanced up when we entered. And this time, he didn't look through me. He raised his bottle, then walked over. Hey, he said. Hey. There was a pause between us. The kind that used to be filled with dismissive remarks or too loud jokes at my expense. Trevor scratched the back of his neck. Been reading a bit since the ceremony, he admitted. On tactics. Theater-level strategy. Honestly, some of it's over my head. I grinned. That's the first step to learning anything. Realizing how much you don't know. He nodded. You got any recommendations? For reading, I mean. Or maybe something you wish you'd known earlier. That took me aback. Trevor asking me for advice? I kept my expression neutral and said, start with Boyd. John Boyd. His ODA loop framework's essential. Then look into asymmetric warfare studies from Rand. I'll send you some files. He lit up like a recruit who'd finally passed inspection. I'd appreciate that, he said. I clapped a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once, firm. You're gonna be fine, Trevor. Just don't mistake medals for mastery. Stay teachable. That line landed harder than I intended. He looked down, thoughtful. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm starting to get that. Later in the evening, as the rest of the family chatted over wine and Eleanor's roasted salmon, Martin called me over to the bookshelf. There, buried between framed photos of Navy ceremonies and a dust-covered encyclopedia set, was a shadow box I'd never seen before. A new one. Black velvet lining. Gold trim. Inside, 3 challenge coins. One I immediately recognized. It was from Carrington. He only gave them out in moments that meant something. You didn't have to do this, I said. Martin shrugged. I didn't. Carrington sent it to me. Said you'd never accept it yourself. I ran my fingers across the glass. It was heavy, even through the casing. Not just the object. The meaning. I was wrong about you, Martin said suddenly. For a long time. I turned, caught him meeting my gaze fully. You weren't wrong, I said. You just didn't have the full intel. He actually chuckled. Guess I trained you too well. Can't argue with that. The next hour passed in a quiet I'd never known in that house. Not silence, but calm. Conversations that didn't feel like sparring matches. Laughter that didn't carry that invisible edge. Even Logan, who once cracked jokes about my mystery job, sat beside me asking real questions about how to build discipline in everyday life. Sienna watched all of it from across the room, her eyes soft, her wine untouched. When I sat beside her again, she leaned into me. Not performative. Just present. You've always been this man, she whispered. I nodded. I just never needed them to know. Until now. You never needed me to know? She asked gently. That question wasn't about shame. It was about us. I wanted to protect you from my world, I said. But I didn't realize what it was costing us. She took my hand. So what now? Now, I said, they know. But more importantly, you do. A beat passed. Then she smiled. Then let's start again. With the truth. I looked around the room, Martin laughing with Doug, Eleanor actually complimenting someone without a backhand twist, Trevor and Logan huddled over a tablet screen discussing tactical briefs I had shared. This wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was visibility. And it was enough. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't the ghost behind the curtain. I was the man in the room. And they saw me. 6 months later, the ceremony was small by design. Black suits, tight smiles. A polished room lined with quiet respect and deeper silence. The kind of event where no one asked questions because everyone already knew the answers, at least, the ones they were cleared to know. Brigadier General Marcus Ellison. The words still felt foreign. Not because I didn't earn them, but because I'd grown used to being anonymous. Used to silence. Now, my name hung in the air like something permanent, and for once, it didn't have to be whispered. Sienna was beside me, her hand warm in mine, the same hand that had once searched for answers I wasn't allowed to give. She didn't need them now. She understood. She stood taller than I'd ever seen her. Across the room, Martin stood among the cleared guests, his navy pin gleaming against his lapel. When my name was called, he didn't blink, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward with military precision, snapped into a salute, and held it. His voice, when it came, was steady, low. "General Ellison." I was wrong. I met his eyes, then returned the salute. "You weren't wrong," I said. "You just didn't have the full intel." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was earned. It was the silence that comes after truth does its work, after years of misunderstanding are stripped bare and the dust is settled. A silence of recognition. As the ceremony ended, Sienna's fingers tightened around mine. Trevor came over, speechless but smiling, shaking my hand with a grip that had changed, firmer now, less performative. The kind of grip you give to someone whose shadow you once stood in. And that's the thing. People always judge what they can't see. They fill in the blanks with disappointment, with failure, with whatever story helps them sleep at night. But the truth doesn't need their permission. It just waits, patiently, until the moment it walks into a room and stands tall enough for everyone to see. That day, I didn't become a new man. I simply let them see the one I'd always been.